Imagine being crowned queen only to be buried in a box meant for arrows, with no ceremony and no dignity. The stories you'll hear tonight were never meant to be remembered. They were buried twice, once beneath stone floors and once in the silence of history. Some of Henry VIII's wives vanished not only from life, but from memory, their graves disturbed, their ghosts reportedly screaming down haunted corridors. In the first 5 seconds, you'll see just how quickly power turns to horror inside a royal palace, so don't even blink. If you're drawn to the shadowy side of history, the secrets, the hauntings, the real fate of the forgotten queens, this is where you belong. Hit subscribe right now, because every hidden chapter we uncover makes it harder for their stories to disappear again. Tonight, you'll descend into the crypts of Tudor England, where the crown brought death, mystery, and terror. Stay to the end. Some tailies refuse to die. May 19th, 1536. Dawn broke cold over the Thames, and inside the Tower of London, a woman who had once been queen woke knowing she had hours left to live. Anne Boleyn had slept little. The stone walls of her chamber were damp, and every footstep echoing down the corridor made her flinch. Was it time? Not yet. The executioner hadn't arrived from France. She'd heard whispers from her ladies. Henry had sent for a specialist. Not the usual hooded brute with his heavy axe and uncertain aim. No, a swordsman. Someone skilled. Someone who could take a head cleanly with one stroke. It should have been a mercy, but Anne knew better. This wasn't kindness, it was theater. Henry wanted her death to be swift, elegant, memorable. A spectacle that would justify what he'd done. The charges against her were lies stitched together with cruelty. Adultery, incest, treason. Every man accused alongside her had already been butchered. Their heads rotted on spikes along London Bridge. And now it was her turn. By mid-morning, they came for her. Her hands trembled as her ladies dressed her in a gray damask gown trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle beneath. She wore a simple white coif over her dark hair, tied at the back. No crown, no jewels. She'd been stripped of everything that once made her untouchable. The walk to the scaffold felt endless. 2,000 eyes watched her cross the courtyard. Nobles, merchants, common folk, they'd all come to see the queen who had bewitched a king now reduced to this. She climbed the wooden steps slowly, holding her composure like armor. Her lips moved in silent prayer, though her voice didn't waver when she finally spoke. She did not curse Henry. She did not beg. She stood before the crowd and forgave those who had condemned her, praised the king's mercy, and asked for prayers. It was rehearsed, controlled, deliberate. But beneath that calm surface, terror simmered. She kept glancing toward the swordsman, a tall figure in dark clothing, his face unreadable. He held no axe, just a long, thin blade that gleamed in the pale morning light. Anne knelt. One of her ladies tied a blindfold across her eyes, her fingers shaking so violently she could barely manage the knot. Anne whispered something. No one recorded what. Then she began to pray aloud. "O Christ, receive my soul. O Lord God, have mercy on my soul. To Christ I commend my soul." The swordsman circled behind her, silent. She couldn't see him, couldn't hear him. The crowd held its breath. And then one clean motion. The blade cut through flesh, muscle, bone. Her head fell forward, rolled slightly. Blood sprayed across the scaffold in a dark, pulsing arc. Her body remained upright for a heartbeat longer, then collapsed. The queen was gone, but the horror was only beginning. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring prayers and curses in equal measure. But Anne's ladies remained frozen on the scaffold, staring at what was left of the woman they had served. One of them, her name lost to history, finally moved. She knelt in the spreading pool of crimson and reached for the head, cradling it like something fragile, something precious. The eyes were still open, the mouth slightly parted, as if mid-prayer. No one had thought to bring a coffin. It seems impossible, doesn't it? A queen, once the most powerful woman in England, executed by royal decree, and yet no one had arranged for her body to be properly received. There was no carved wood waiting, no velvet lining, no ceremonial preparation, just a blood-soaked scaffold and a growing sense of panic among the women tasked with handling her remains. They wrapped her in a white cloth, their hands shaking so badly they could barely tie the knots. The fabric soaked through almost immediately, dark stains blooming across the linen like grotesque flowers. One lady sobbed openly. Another turned away and vomited over the edge of the platform. The smell iron and meat and something sharper clung to everything. Meanwhile, a yeoman warder was sent scrambling through the tower's storage rooms. He wasn't looking for anything dignified. He was looking for anything that would fit. He passed barrels, crates, old furniture rotting in corners. And then he found it an elm chest, battered and forgotten, shoved against a damp stone wall in the armory. It had been used to store bow staves, arrows, weapons meant for war, not the body of a woman who had once worn a crown. The chest was rough, unpolished, barely large enough. But it would have to do. They carried it to the scaffold. When the lid was pried open, the smell of old wood and mildew wafted out. The ladies stared at it in horror. This was what remained of Anne Boleyn's dignity? But there was no alternative. They lifted her body still warm, still bleeding, and tried to fit it inside. It didn't go easily. The chest was too narrow. Her limbs had to be adjusted, folded inward. Her head, wrapped separately, was placed beside her torso, nestled against her shoulder like some terrible, intimate secret. The lid was forced shut, nails driven in. And just like that, the woman who had defied Rome, who had reshaped England's faith, who had danced with a king and borne him a daughter, was reduced to cargo, sealed in a box meant for tools of death, carried by men who averted their eyes and said nothing. No ceremony, no procession, just a makeshift coffin that smelled of war and a silence that felt heavier than stone. They would bury her within hours. But even then, the disrespect wouldn't end. The chapel of St. Peter at Vincula sits in the shadow of the tower's walls, a squat stone building that has witnessed more death than prayer. Its name means St. Peter in chains, a fitting dedication for a place where England's traitors are laid to rest. The air inside is always cold, even in summer. Damp seeps through the walls. And on the afternoon of May 19th, it was waiting to receive another body. They carried the arrow chest down the narrow aisle, boots echoing against stone. The chapel was nearly empty. No nobles, no court officials, no one of importance. Just a handful of tower staff, a nervous chaplain clutching his prayer book, and Anne's 4 remaining ladies, their faces pale and tear-streaked. There was a pit already dug in front of the high altar shallow, barely 3 feet deep. Freshly turned earth gave off the smell of clay and rot. Another grave lay beside it. George Boleyn, Anne's brother. He'd been buried just days earlier, condemned for the same invented crimes. Now they would lie side by side for eternity, victims of a king's paranoia and a court's betrayal. The men lowered the chest into the ground. It landed with a hollow thud that seemed to echo forever. No one spoke. The chaplain began to recite prayers in Latin, his voice rushed and uncertain. He didn't want to be here. None of them did. This was dangerous proximity, standing over the grave of a woman, declared traitor, heretic, adulteress. Being seen mourning her could draw suspicion, could invite questions. So the prayers were brief, perfunctory, the kind you'd say over a pauper, not a queen. And when they ended, the men began shoveling dirt back into the pit. Each shovelful landed on the elm chest with a dull, muffled sound, covering her, erasing her, burying not just her body, but the memory of what she'd been. No marker was placed, No stone carved with her name. No indication that Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother to a princess, the woman who had changed the course of history, lay beneath that patch of chapel floor. It was as if she'd never existed. The ladies stood frozen, watching the dirk rise. One tried to step forward, perhaps to say something, to protest this final indignity. But another grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "Don't. It's too late. She's gone." When the grave was filled, the men packed the earth down with their boots. Then they left, quickly, silently. The chapel door slammed shut behind them, and the sound reverberated through the empty space like a final judgment. Anne Boleyn was alone now, in the darkness, in the cold, forgotten, or so they thought. For 300 years she stayed there, silent, still, lost beneath the chapel floor while the world above moved on. Kings rose and fell, dynasties ended, wars came and went, and through it all, Anne Boleyn lay forgotten in the darkness, her bones settling into the earth that had swallowed her so carelessly. But in 1876, the chapel needed repairs. The floors were cracking, the foundations unstable. Victorian engineers arrived with plans to renovate, to modernize, to make the ancient building safe again. They brought shovels and surveying equipment, expecting to dig through layers of stone and clay. They weren't expecting to find bodies. The first skeleton appeared beneath the altar steps, fragmented, incomplete, bones jumbled together as if someone had thrown them into a pit without care. Then another, and another. A mass grave of the executed, their remains tangled and compressed by centuries of weight. Some skulls were cracked. Others bore the unmistakable marks of decapitation, clean cuts through vertebrae, evidence of the axe or sword that had ended their lives. Dr. Frederick Mouet was summoned to examine the remains. He moved through the excavation site with clinical detachment, categorizing bones, taking measurements, making notes. Most of the skeletons were male, large frames, evidence of violent death. He cataloged them methodically, his pen scratching across paper in the cold chapel air. And then he found her. A smaller skeleton, delicate bone structure, female, age approximately 25 to 30. A skull was separate from the body, decapitation confirmed. The vertebrae of the neck showed a single, clean cut. Professional work. Not the rough hacking of an amateur executioner, but the precise stroke of someone skilled. But something was wrong. The bones weren't arranged properly. They'd been disturbed, moved, piled together in a way that suggested another grave had been dug nearby, cutting through hers, displacing her remains. Someone else had been buried too close, their coffin crashing down into the space where Anne lay, scattering her bones like discarded refuse. Even in death, she'd been violated. Mouet lifted the skull carefully, turning it in the dim light filtering through the chapel windows. Small, graceful, the jaw still intact. He imagined the face that had once covered these bones, the woman who had mesmerized a king, who had worn crowns and jewels, who had danced through palace halls, believing herself untouchable. Now she was fragments, pieces, a puzzle that couldn't be reassembled. They gathered what remained of her, every bone they could identify, every fragment they could separate from the surrounding earth, and placed her in a proper coffin this time. Smooth wood, clean lining. The dignity she'd been denied in 1536. But the horror lingered. Because the excavation revealed something else, something the records hadn't mentioned. She hadn't been alone down there in the darkness. She'd been surrounded by the other executed, criminals, traitors, forgotten souls, all of them thrown into shallow graves and left to rot together. A queen buried among the condemned, her memory erased, her grave unmarked. Until now. 6 years passed. The chapel remained undisturbed, its secrets locked beneath cold stone. But Henry's appetite for wives and for vengeance hadn't dulled. Catherine Howard was barely more than a child when she became queen. 17, maybe 18 years old. Some historians believe she was even younger. A girl with rose-petal skin and auburn hair, who had no idea what she was walking into when Henry's eyes fixed on her across the court. He was grotesque by then. 50 years old. Morbidly obese. His leg rotted with ulcers that stank of decay and leaked pus through the bandages. He couldn't walk without assistance. Couldn't mount a horse. Could barely fit through doorways. But he was still king, and when he decided he wanted Catherine Howard, no one dared say no. She smiled. She curtsied. She accepted the jewels he draped around her neck like chains. And on July 28, 1540, she became his fifth wife, standing beside a man old enough to be her grandfather, his breath rancid with disease, his hands clammy and desperate. They called it a marriage. It was a trap. Catherine tried to play the role. She wore the gowns. She attended the feasts. She laughed at his jokes and pretended not to notice the way his body repulsed her. But she was so young. Too young to understand the scrutiny, the danger, the knives hidden behind every smile at court. And she made mistakes. November 1541. The All Saints' Day feast had just ended. Henry was in high spirits, showering Catherine with gifts, calling her his rose without a thorn. But behind closed doors, whispers were spreading. Dangerous whispers. A man named John Lascelles approached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer with information. Damning information. He claimed his sister, Mary Hall, had served in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household alongside Catherine. And she'd seen things, heard things. Catherine Howard, before she became queen, had been indiscreet. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, young, handsome, everything Henry was not. Mary Hall claimed Catherine had been meeting him in secret. Late-night encounters. Whispered conversations behind tapestries. Love letters passed through trembling hands. Cranmer's blood went cold. If this was true, if even a fraction of it was true, it meant treason. Queens did not take lovers. Queens who did face the axe. He brought the accusations to Henry during Mass on November 2nd, handed him a letter outlining everything. Then he stepped back and watched the king's face transform. First, disbelief. Henry laughed, called it slander. His rose? His perfect Catherine? Impossible. Then doubt crept in. His smile faded. His hands began to shake, and finally rage. He stood up so violently, his chair crashed backward. Guards rushed forward, thinking he was having a seizure. But Henry was conscious, furiously, terrifyingly conscious. He began screaming incoherent, animalistic sounds of betrayal and fury. Tears streamed down his bloated face. He demanded a sword. Right there, in the chapel, he would kill her himself. He would cut her throat and watch her bleed. His advisers restrained him. Barely. Catherine Howard's world was about to end. And unlike Anne Boleyn, she wouldn't face it with dignity. She would face it screaming. They placed Catherine under house arrest at Hampton Court Palace. Not in a dungeon, not in chains. Just confined to her apartments with guards stationed outside every door, watching her every movement, reporting every word she spoke. The silence was worse than any torture. She could hear the palace continuing around her footsteps in distant corridors, voices murmuring behind walls, the clatter of dishes being carried to feasts she was no longer allowed to attend. Life moved on without her, and she was trapped in these rooms, waiting for judgment, waiting for the inevitable. Days blurred together. Her ladies tried to comfort her, but what comfort was there? Catherine knew what happened to queens accused of adultery. She'd heard the stories about Anne Boleyn. Everyone had. The sword, the blood, the arrow chest grave. November 7th. A Sunday morning. The palace bells rang for Mass, their sound echoing through the cold autumn air. Catherine stood at her window, watching courtiers file toward the chapel royal in their finest clothes. And somewhere among them was Henry, her husband, the man who'd called her his rose, his perfect Catherine, who'd showered her with jewels and affection. He was in the chapel now, praying, just beyond 2 locked doors and a long gallery. Something snapped inside her. She moved before she could think, pushed past her startled ladies, threw herself at the door. The guards outside weren't expecting it. She'd been so docile, so quiet, they'd grown careless. The door flew open under her weight, and suddenly she was free, running barefoot down the long gallery, her gown tangling around her legs. The haunted gallery, they call it now. Over 400 years later, tourists walk through it and feel cold spots, hear screams that echo from nowhere. But on that November morning, there was nothing supernatural about Catherine's terror. It was raw, human, desperate. She ran toward the chapel royal, her voice breaking into shrieks that shattered the Sunday morning peace. "Henry, Henry, please, I beg you, mercy, mercy." Her hands clawed at the air, reaching for doors she couldn't see, for a salvation that didn't exist. Behind her, the guards recovered from their shock. Heavy boots pounded against wooden floors. Rough hands grabbed her arms, her shoulders, her hair. "No, please, let me speak to him. Henry. For God's sake, Henry." Inside the chapel, Henry heard her. Everyone heard her. Her screams tore through the sacred space like knives through silk. But he didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her existence. They dragged her backward down the gallery, her nails scratching uselessly at the floor, her voice dissolving into animal sounds of pure fear. The chapel doors remained closed. Henry remained kneeling in prayer. He would never see her again. And Catherine Howard's screams would echo down that corridor forever. They locked her away after that, moved her from Hampton Court to Syon Abbey, a cold monastery on the outskirts of London, where the walls wept with moisture and the floors were freezing stone. No more silk gowns, no more jewels. Just rough wool and the constant watch of guards who wouldn't meet her eyes. Catherine deteriorated quickly, stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Her hair fell out in clumps from stress. She rocked back and forth in her cell, whispering prayers that dissolved into incoherent sobbing. She was 18 years old, maybe 19, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die. November 22nd. They came with a document bearing the royal seal. Catherine Howard was no longer queen. The title had been stripped away by parliamentary decree, erased as if it had never existed. She was nobody now. Just another traitor awaiting judgment. But Henry wasn't satisfied with her suffering alone. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were arrested, interrogated, tortured until they confessed to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. Culpeper admitted to meetings with Catherine, to whispered conversations, to desire. Derham's confession was extracted with instruments that left him barely human by the end. December 1st. Tyburn Gallows. Public execution. Culpeper went first. They gave him mercy a clean beheading, quick and final. His head rolled into the straw, and the crowd roared approval. Then came Derham. They hanged him until he was nearly dead, choking and convulsing at the end of the rope. Then they cut him down while he still gasped for air, stripped him naked before the screaming crowd. The executioner's knife opened his abdomen, pulling out his intestines while he was still conscious, still feeling every cut. His screams lasted longer than anyone thought possible. Finally, mercifully, they took his head, then quartered his body into pieces, displaying them on spikes throughout London as warning. Catherine heard about it, every detail. Her guards made sure she knew, made sure she understood what happened to traitors, made sure she lay awake at night imagining Francis Derham's screams echoing across Tyburn. But there was something else, something worse than the executions, something that made Catherine's blood run cold when she finally understood what was happening. Henry had pushed through a new law specifically for her, a bill of attainder that declared her guilty without trial, without defense, without hope. But it went further. It stated that any future queen who concealed a sexual past before marriage would be guilty of treason. Any woman who dared to bring shame to the king would face death. The law was Catherine's death warrant. Signed, sealed, waiting. January 21st, 1542. The bill of attainder passed. Catherine Howard was condemned. Lady Rochford, who had arranged the secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper, was condemned alongside her. The execution date was set for February 13th, 3 weeks to live. 3 weeks to contemplate the axe. 3 weeks listening to hammers, building the scaffold that would hold her final moments. And in those 3 weeks, Catherine practiced something no queen should ever have to practice. She learned how to die. February 10th. They came for her at dawn, dragging her from Sion Abbey and forcing her into a barge that would carry her down the Thames to the Tower. Catherine fought them, screamed, clawed at their faces. But her strength meant nothing against armored men who'd been ordered to deliver her alive. The barge glided beneath London Bridge, and Catherine looked up. There, rotting on spikes above the archway, were 2 heads, blackened, pecked by crows, barely recognizable as human. But she knew who they were. Thomas Culpeper, Francis Derham, the men she'd loved, or tried to love, or been accused of loving. Their empty eye sockets seemed to track her passage beneath them. She vomited over the side of the barge. Traitor's Gate swallowed her into the tower's belly. The same gate Anne Boleyn had passed through 6 years earlier. The same cold stone corridors. The same suffocating sense of finality. They locked her in the royal apartments. A cruel joke, treating her like royalty while preparing her execution. February 12th. Evening. The constable of the tower entered her chamber with measured steps. His face revealed nothing as he spoke the words that shattered her last thread of hope. You are to prepare your soul for death. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. The scaffold is ready. Catherine collapsed. Her ladies caught her before she hit the floor, but she was beyond comfort, beyond prayer, beyond anything except raw, animal terror. And then she made a request that would haunt everyone who heard it. Bring me the block. They thought they'd misheard. But she repeated it, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. The executioner's block. The wooden cradle that would hold her head for the axe. She wanted it brought to her chamber. Now, they obeyed. What else could they do? For hours through the night, Catherine Howard practiced dying, knelt on the cold floor, positioned her neck just so, adjusted her posture, rose, repeated, over and over and over. Her ladies watched in horror as their teenage queen rehearsed the moment of her own death with the dedication of an actress preparing for a performance. She was terrified of a botched execution, of the axe missing, of multiple strikes, of prolonged agony. If she positioned herself perfectly, if her neck was precisely angled, maybe, just maybe, it would be quick. Dawn broke. They dressed her in black velvet, tied her hair back. Her hands shook so violently they could barely fasten the clasps. At 9 o'clock, the constable returned. It was time. The walk to Tower Green lasted forever. Her legs gave out twice. Guards had to support her, practically carrying her up the scaffold steps. The crowd watched in silence as this girl barely out of childhood faced the instrument of her death. She tried to speak. Her lips moved. Something about deserving this, about the king's mercy. But her voice was so weak, so broken, that few could hear. They removed her oud, bound her eyes. She knelt perfectly positioned, just as she'd practiced. Her neck rested against the wood. One stroke, clean, final. Catherine Howard's head rolled into the straw, and within hours, her body was thrown into the ground beside Anne Boleyn's. No ceremony. No coffin. Just another queen discarded like refuse in the chapel of the forgotten. Henry didn't mourn Catherine Howard. He couldn't afford to. Mourning her would mean acknowledging what he'd done, twice now executing wives on fabricated charges, destroying young women who'd once shared his bed. So instead, he buried the memory of her along with her body and turned his attention elsewhere. 16 months later, he married again. Catherine Parr was 31 years old when she became Henry's sixth wife. She was no naive teenager dazzled by crowns and power. She was a widow, twice over. A woman who deburied 2 husbands and learned how to navigate the dangerous waters of Tudor politics with careful words and even more careful silences. She knew exactly what kind of man she was marrying, a bloated tyrant whose leg rotted with infection, whose temper could turn lethal in an instant, whose previous wives had ended up divorced, dead, or discarded. But Catherine had no choice. When a king decides he wants you, refusal isn't an option. July 12, 1543. She stood beside Henry in the Queen's East Closet at Hampton Court and spoke her wedding vows in a voice that betrayed nothing. Not fear, not reluctance, just dutiful acceptance. She became his sixth queen, stepping into a role that had already claimed 2 lives and destroyed countless others. And for 4 years, Catherine Parr survived. She played the game perfectly, tended to Henry's rotting leg without flinching, managed his children bitter Mary, watchful Elizabeth, sickly Edward, with patience and political cunning. She smiled when required, stayed silent when necessary, avoided the mistakes that had doomed Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. She outlived him. January 28, 1547. Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace, his massive body finally surrendering to decades of excess and disease. He was 55 years old, and Catherine Parr, the wife who'd survived the unsurvivable, was finally free. Or so everyone thought. Within months, Catherine married Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. It was a love match this time, not a political arrangement. She was 35 years old and finally allowed to choose her own husband, finally able to live for herself instead of managing a dying tyrant's ego. And then impossibly, dangerously, she became pregnant. Childbirth at 35 in the 16th century was a death sentence waiting to happen. Catherine knew this. Everyone knew this. But she carried the child anyway, perhaps believing that after everything she'd endured, she deserved this one piece of happiness, this one chance at being a mother. September 5th, 1548, Sudeley Castle. Catherine Parr went into labor screaming. The baby came a girl, healthy, squalling with life. Catherine held her daughter for a few precious hours, whispering promises she would never keep. And then the fever started. Within days, Catherine Parr was dead. The queen who'd survived Henry VIII, the woman who'd navigated the most dangerous court in Europe and emerged unscathed, gone, just like that. But something about her death didn't sit right. Something felt wrong. And the way they buried her, rushed, sealed, hidden only, deepened the mystery. Royal funerals take time, weeks, usually, months, sometimes. The body must be embalmed, displayed, mourned. Processions organized. Nobles summoned from across the kingdom. Elaborate ceremonies planned down to the smallest detail. A queen's funeral is theater of final performance of power and prestige that honors both the deceased and the dynasty she served. Catherine Parr was buried in 48 hours. No procession. No state funeral. No royal attendants traveling from London to pay respects. Just a hasty service at St. Mary's Chapel on the grounds of Sudeley Castle, conducted by her chaplain with a handful of witnesses who looked uncomfortable and spoke in whispers. Something was very, very wrong. Thomas Seymour stood at the graveside, his face unreadable. He'd been with Catherine during her final days, heard her accusations, watched her deteriorate from childbirth fever into raving delirium. She'd accused him of things, dark things, neglect, cruelty, betrayal, words spoken in fever madness that perhaps held fragments of truth. Now she was silent, forever. The workers had prepared her body with unusual thoroughness. 6 layers of sear cloth-waxed linen that clung to her skin like a second death, each layer wrapped tighter than the last, sealing her completely. Then they placed her in a fitted lead coffin, custom-made to her exact dimensions. The lead was thick, heavy, designed not just to contain, but to preserve. Why? Lead coffins prevented decomposition, sealed the body away from air, moisture, decay. But Catherine Parr wasn't royalty anymore. She was a dowager queen, stripped of her crown when Henry died. She had no state significance, no political importance. Her burial should have been modest, dignified, but simple. Instead, they treated her like they were hiding evidence. The chapel at Sudeley was small, isolated, over 100 miles from London. By the time word reached the court that Catherine Parr had died, she was already underground, sealed in lead, wrapped in wax, hidden. Poison was whispered, not loudly, not publicly, but in dark corners and behind closed hands, the word circulated. Thomas Seymour had ambitions, dangerous ambitions. He'd wanted Catherine's connections, her wealth, her influence. Had he wanted Catherine herself, or just what she represented? And when she became pregnant, when she became a liability instead of an asset, had he decided she was no longer useful? No one could prove anything. The body was sealed, married, gone, but the speed of it haunted everyone who knew. 48 hours? From death to grave in less time than it takes most corpses to grow cold. As if someone wanted her hidden, forgotten, silenced before questions could be asked. Catherine Parr had survived Henry VIII. She'd outlasted the monster who'd executed 2 wives and destroyed countless others. But she hadn't survived whatever happened in that castle, in that birthing chamber, in those final, feverish hours when she screamed accusations at the man who'd sworn to love her. And now she was sealed away, preserved like a specimen, buried like a secret, waiting to be discovered. They worked through the night preparing her body. 6 servants in the lower chambers of Sudeley Castle, their hands moving quickly, methodically, wrapping Catherine Parr's corpse in layers of waxed linen that clung to her cooling skin like a second burial shroud. 1 layer, 2, 3. The cerecloth was thick, expensive, imported specifically for this purpose. Each strip was soaked in beeswax and resin, making it waterproof, airtight, impenetrable. The kind of material used to preserve meat for long voyages, to keep things from rotting. 4 layers, 5, 6. By the time they finished, Catherine Parr no longer looked human. She was a mummy, wrapped so tightly her features had disappeared beneath the yellowed fabric. Only the vague outline of a woman remained, a shape, a suggestion, a secret sealed away from air and light and decay. Then came the coffin. Not wood, lead, custom-made to her exact measurements, as if someone had anticipated this moment weeks in advance. The interior was lined with more fabric, but the lead itself was what mattered. Heavy, dense, impenetrable. Once sealed, nothing could get in. Nothing could get out. Lead coffins were reserved for royalty, for bodies that needed to travel long distances without decomposing, for kings and queens whose remains would lie in state for weeks while the kingdom mourned. But Catherine Parr wasn't traveling anywhere. She died at Sudeley Castle, and her chapel was less than 200 yards away across the courtyard. There was no reason, no practical reason, to seal her in lead. Unless someone wanted to make absolutely certain that her body stayed preserved, intact, unexamined. The servants lifted her wrapped form into the fitted casket. It was so precise that she barely fit, the lead walls pressing against the cerecloth on all sides. They lowered the heavy lid and began soldering it shut, the hot metal hissing and spitting as it fused the seams together. Permanent, irreversible, final. Thomas Seymour watched from the doorway, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight. He said nothing, gave no instructions, just stood there, observing as his wife disappeared beneath layers of wax and metal, sealed away from the world forever. Why the rush? Why the excessive preservation? Why treat her like evidence that needed to be hidden? Royal burials took months. Catherine's took 48 hours. And in those 2 days, her body was prepared with a thoroughness that suggested premeditation, as if someone had known she would die, as if someone had been ready. The fever had come on so suddenly. One moment she was weak but recovering from childbirth. The next she was raving, accusing Thomas of betrayal, screaming about poison and lies and things that made the servants exchange nervous glances. Then silence. And now this. A sealed tomb. A rushed burial. A queen preserved like a specimen, locked away in lead and wax where no one could ever examine her remains, where no physician could study her organs, where no investigation could determine what really killed Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, the survivor who didn't survive, sealed, hidden, forgotten, or so they hoped. 234 years passed. The chapel crumbled. Sudeley Castle changed hands through wars and revolutions. The English Civil War reduced the grounds to rubble, Roundhead soldiers smashing monuments and desecrating graves. Catherine Parr's tomb marker was destroyed, her location forgotten beneath ivy and broken stone. And then, in 1782, curiosity brought visitors. A group of ladies on a day trip to the ruins noticed something, a large block of alabaster, embedded in the chapel as north wall. They became convinced it marked something important, something buried. They hired local men to dig beneath it, expecting perhaps foundation stones or old religious artifacts. 2 feet down, the shovels struck lead. A coffin, fitted, custom-made, with an inscription still visible despite centuries underground. Here lieth Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry VIII. They'd found her. The ladies couldn't resist. They pried open the lid, making 2 holes, one over the face, another over the chest. And what they saw stopped their breath. Catherine Parr looked alive. Her face was intact, perfect. The eyes impossibly remained in a state of preservation that seemed supernatural. Her skin was still white, still moist, as if she'd died yesterday instead of 2 centuries ago. The cerecloth had worked exactly as intended, sealing her away from decay, keeping her frozen in time like some macabre wax sculpture. They panicked, threw dirt back into the coffin without sealing the holes they'd made, left her there, exposed through 2 gaping openings in the lead, vulnerable to air and moisture and the decay they'd just unleashed. Within months, she began rotting. 1784. The horror escalated. Ruffians, tomb robbers, curiosity seekers, vandals dug her up again. They pulled the corpse from its coffin completely and threw it onto a heap of rubbish. Left it there, exposed to public view. People came to gawk at the decomposing queen, to point and whisper and marvel at the rotting flesh of Henry VIII's final wife. Some took souvenirs, locks of auburn hair, teeth pried from her skull, fragments of her burial dress, pieces of Catherine Parr distributed across the countryside like grotesque relics. She was exhumed again in 1786, then 1817, each time more decay, each time less of her remaining. By the final disturbance, Catherine Parr, the scholar queen, the survivor, the woman who de-navigated Henry VIII's escort with intelligence and grace, had been reduced to little brown dust mixed with scattered bones. When they finally found her in 1817, ready to move her to a proper vault, they discovered something that haunts every account. She was buried upside down, face first in the earth. And around her skull, ivy had grown a living wreath, green and twisted, crowning the queen who'd been denied dignity in both death and discovery. In 1861, what remained of Catherine Parr was finally sealed in a proper tomb. A marble effigy, a neo-Gothic monument, beautiful, reverent, permanent. 313 years after her death, Catherine Parr was allowed to rest. But the damage was done. She'd been violated, displayed, dismembered, and scattered. The queen who survived Henry VIII couldn't survive the centuries that followed. While Catherine Parr was being violated and displayed at Sudeley Castle, 2 other queens lay in darkness beneath the Tower of London. Silent, forgotten, waiting. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula stands in the northwest corner of the Tower grounds, its stone walls blackened by centuries of London smoke and Thames fog. The name translates to St. Peter in Chains, a dedication that feels less like religious devotion and more like prophecy, because everyone buried here died in chains, metaphorically, literally, sometimes both. Construction finished in 1520, just 16 years before it would receive its first queen. Henry VIII had commissioned the renovations, never imagining that 2 of his own wives would end up beneath its floor, their bones mingling with common traders and forgotten criminals. The chapel wasn't designed for royalty. It was built as a convenience, a practical solution to a logistical problem. What do you do with the bodies of people you've just executed inside the Tower walls? You can't parade them through London streets. You can't give them elaborate funerals. You certainly can't bury them in Westminster Abbey alongside kings and saints. So you throw them in the Traitors' Chapel, in unmarked graves, in shallow pits barely 3 feet deep, and you forget they ever existed. By the time Anne Boleyn was beheaded in 1536, the chapel had already swallowed dozens of bodies. Nobles who'd backed the wrong faction, priests who'd refused to accept Henry's supremacy, common criminals whose crimes warranted Tower imprisonment. They lay beneath the stone floor in rough clusters, bones touching bones, identities erased. Anne joined them, then Catherine Howard 6 years later. 2 queens buried like criminals, their graves indistinguishable from the murders and traitors surrounding them. Walk into St. Peter ad Vincula today, and you'll feel it immediately, the weight. A cold that has nothing to do with temperature. The air tastes different here, thicker, as if the stone walls have absorbed centuries of final prayers and dying screams, and now exhale them back in measured doses. The floor is uneven, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, but warped in places where the earth beneath has settled and shifted, where graves have collapsed inward, where bodies have decomposed and left hollow spaces that the ground slowly fills. Somewhere beneath your feet, Anne Boleyn's skull rests against the bones of her brother. Catherine Howard's remains have long since dissolved into the soil that received them so carelessly. And around them, pressing close in the darkness, are the forgotten others, the nameless executed, the discarded traitors, the prisoners who died waiting for judgment that never came. Over 100 bodies were eventually buried here, some in coffins, most without, some with their heads, others in pieces, their bodies quartered and distributed across London as warnings before the remaining fragments were swept into Tower graves. St. Peter in Chains, the chapel where chains physical and spiritual end, where power dissolves into bone, where queens become indistinguishable from criminals, and where secrets stayed buried. Until someone started digging. The Tower kept records. Of course it did. Every execution, every burial, every traitor's body thrown into the chapel floor was noted in a leather-bound register kept under lock and key in the Constable S office. The entries were brief, clinical, no emotion. Just names, dates, locations. The corpses with the heads are buried in the chapel at the high altar. That's how they described Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn. Not Queen Anne or Lord Rochford, just corpses with heads. As if that detail mattered more than their titles, their crimes, their humanity. Catherine Howard got the same treatment 6 years later. Another line in the register. Another corpse noted and forgotten. Her name scrawled in ink that would fade over centuries until it became barely legible. A ghost of information about a woman who'd become a ghost herself. But the register was never meant for posterity. It was administrative, practical. The tower needed to know where bodies were placed, so future digging wouldn't accidentally disturb them. So new graves wouldn't collapse into old ones. So the chapel floor wouldn't cave in under the weight of accumulated dead. Except the register disappeared. No one knows exactly when. Sometime during the English Civil War, probably when Roundhead soldiers ransacked the tower, destroying anything that smacked of royalty or Catholic tradition. The leather binding might have been torn apart, the pages used for kindling, the information lost to flames or flood or simple neglect. By the 18th century, no one knew exactly where anyone was buried. The chapel had become a mystery. Locals whispered that queens lay beneath the stones. But which stones? Near the altar, they said. But the altar area was large, and 300 years of foot traffic had worn the floor smooth, erasing any subtle depressions that might have marked grave sites. Tower officials consulted old chronicles. John Stow's writings from the 1500s mentioned Anne Boleyn's location before the high altar. But before could mean anywhere in a 10-foot radius. And the floor had been repaired multiple times since then. Stones lifted and replaced, potentially shifting positions, obscuring original burial sites. The chapel became a puzzle with missing pieces. Visitors walked across the floor, unknowingly stepping on queens and nobles and forgotten criminals whose bones lay inches beneath their feet. No markers, no memorials. No acknowledgement that these people had ever lived, loved, ruled, died. Tour guides told stories, but they were guesses, speculation. Anne Boleyn is probably somewhere around here. Probably, maybe, we think. And beneath the uncertainty, beneath the worn stones and accumulated silence, the bodies waited, bones settling deeper into earth with each passing year. Skulls separating from spines as wooden coffins rotted and collapsed, remains mingling as graves compressed and merged. The dead were losing their identities, becoming anonymous, just as Henry had intended when he ordered them buried without ceremony, without markers, without dignity. But secrets have a way of surfacing. And in 1876, the chapel floor began to collapse. The cracks appeared slowly at first, hairline fractures spreading across the chapel's stone floor like veins beneath pale skin, then larger splits, then actual depressions where the ground had begun sinking beneath the weight of 3 centuries' worth of corpses piled on top of corpses. By 1876, the problem had become impossible to ignore. Worshippers entering for Sunday services found the floor undulating beneath their feet, solid stone that somehow felt soft, unstable, wrong. The tower's constable, Sir Charles York, submitted urgent repair plans to Queen Victoria. The chapel's foundations were failing. Something had to be done. When the workers began lifting the flagstones, they expected to find settled earth, maybe some structural damage from moisture seepage. Instead, they found a charnel house. Bones everywhere, not neatly arranged in coffins or organized burial plots. Just bones, scattered, jumbled, thrown together in heaps as if someone had been playing with human remains like children's blocks. Skulls mixed with femurs, rib cages crushed flat, spines separated into individual vertebrae that lay scattered like macabre rosary beads across the exposed earth. The workers stopped, stepped back, called for medical expertise because this wasn't construction anymore. It was archaeology. It was horror. Dr. Frederick Mawut arrived with his leather medical bag and his notebooks and his clinical detachment that would be tested by what he was about to see. He knelt in the excavated pit and began sorting through centuries of death, trying to separate individual bodies from the chaos. Male skeleton here. Large frame. Probable nobleman based on bone density suggesting good nutrition. Skull detached executed by beheading. He set it aside and moved to the next pile. Female remains. Smaller. Younger. Mixed with what appeared to be fragments of at least 2 other bodies. The graves had been disturbed repeatedly, he realized. New burials had cut through old ones, coffins collapsing downward and scattering the remains of whoever lay beneath. The disrespect was staggering. These weren't just common criminals. Some of these bones belonged to nobles, queens, people who'd once wielded power and commanded respect. Now they were literally piled on top of each other in compressed layers of forgotten identity. Week after week, Mowat worked in the chapel's cold interior, cataloging remains, measuring skulls, noting evidence of violent death. Vertebrae severed by axe blows. Skulls fractured by rough handling. Bones showing evidence of hasty burial thrown rather than placed. And then, in November, they reached the area directly in front of the high altar. The space where Anne Boleyn should be, where the lost register had indicated her burial, where 340 years ago an arrow chest had been lowered into shallow earth. They dug carefully now, reverently, because if she was here, if they'd finally found her, this moment mattered. 2 feet down, the shovel struck something. Not wood that had rotted away centuries ago, but bone. A concentration of skeletal remains piled together in one small area. Dr. Mowat brushed away the dirt with his hands, his breath visible in the cold chapel air. And there she was. Female skeleton. Age 25 to 30. Delicate bone structure. Petite frame under 5 feet tall. The skull was separated from the body, lying several inches away, as if it had rolled when the grave was disturbed. Dr. Mowat lifted it carefully, turning it in the dim chapel light. Small, graceful. The cervical vertebrae showed a single, clean cut straight through the 4th and 5th vertebrae with surgical precision. Not the rough hacking of an axe-wielding executioner, but the work of a master swordsman. Someone skilled enough to sever a neck in one stroke. Someone imported from France, specifically for this execution. Around the bones, they found fragments of elm wood, old, decayed, but unmistakably from an arrow chest. The kind used to store weapons in the Tower Armory. The kind grabbed in desperation when no coffin had been prepared for a fallen queen. This was Anne Boleyn. But the condition of her remains told a secondary horror story. The bones had been piled together, not arranged as they would be in an undisturbed grave. Another burial had crashed down into hers sometime in the 1700s, scattering her skeleton, mixing her bones with dirt and debris, violating her rest even in death. The disrespect was absolute, complete. She'd been executed on false charges, buried in a box meant for arrows, thrown into an unmarked grave, and then disturbed by careless gravediggers who hadn't even known she was there. Nearby, they found another female skeleton, younger, even more poorly preserved. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, buried beside the 2nd in the same chapel of forgotten queens. The excavation continued for weeks. 33 bodies were eventually identified from the mass of remains. But over 1,500 skeletons were found in total, far more than anyone had imagined. The chapel floor was literally built on layers of corpses, compressed and compacted over centuries until the ground couldn't hold anymore and began collapsing under the weight of accumulated death. Queen Victoria ordered proper reburial for the identified remains. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were placed in a marble-paved vault beneath the chapel floor, their names finally carved in stone after 340 years of anonymity. A memorial was installed. Tourists could visit, pay respects, acknowledge what had been hidden, but something remained. something the Victorians couldn't seal away with marble and ceremony. The hauntings intensified after the excavation. Tower guards reported seeing a headless woman in Tudor dress drifting through the corridors at night, sometimes near the execution site, sometimes near the chapel, always moving toward the place where her bones now lay. Catherine Howard's ghost was seen at Hampton Court, still screaming down the gallery where she'd begged for mercy, still running toward a king who refused to hear her. And in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, visitors report inexplicable cold spots, the sound of whispered prayers, the feeling of being watched by eyes that no longer exist. Henry VIII destroyed these women, but he couldn't silence them. Some stories refused to stay buried.